Wetting out my laps, and I've traced where my laps are, and I'll try and wet that out as well. On these shears, you're going to leave a lot of glue. You want to try and get as much squeeze out as you can to be sure that the laps are filled, but also because on this side you can see, this one I've already done, the plank on this side does come a little bit beyond where the lap is. So there's a tiny little bit of a gap there that gives you sort of a mini fillet, and also just sort of more gluing surface, a little bit more strength in that shear plank. So the ideal thing is to get a lot of that from squeeze out instead of having to try and trowel in any extra epoxy. Part. One thing I will say about this, I did the dry fit with slightly shorter screws, and that's because I found going into end grain plywood had a tendency to sort of strip itself out and not really grip quite as well as I wanted it to. So I start with a 5/8 screw, and then my final screw is a 7/8, and then it'll drive itself in a little bit more, less likely to sort of spin out. A nice solid grab. So open up some of my drywall screws. Now in dry fitting this, I did kind of go through and check and see where the planks were kind of coming off the molds a little bit, and then just single or double. You kind of don't have to go too overboard. So it's sitting nicely on this one. It's coming off on this frame, this mold, so I added a single drywall screw. And you do want to be careful on these sort of center molds where the plank is landing flat. It's not too much of a concern, but further forward and aft, the plank isn't landing square on the mold in there. It's landing at an angle. And so if your drywall screw is put in, and you can see it here, actually this is a good example, maybe you can catch that. If I drive this in really tight, it flexes the plank kind of square to that mold, and that's what I don't want. I don't want to create a weird sort of bow in the plank there. So I'm driving the screw just until it touches on the mold on the inside. I might even back it off a tiny bit and just make sure that I'm not creating a weird shape. And so if you do find that you have to put one on these like forward molds, make sure you're getting it on an angle, or you're not screwing it in so that you're pressing it flat against the molds when it really only wants to be on the forward edge. And these screws do need to be countersunk. You know, they're going in at an angle to the plank, so they're in line with the transom there. But they do need to be countersunk enough so that you have enough room to get some putty over there. When you cut the end of the plank flush with the transom, you're not running into fasteners. But also this is a really thin plank, so if you countersink too much, you run the risk of sort of not leaving enough for the shoulder of the screw to grab onto. So there's a little bit of a fine balance in there, making sure that you're countersinking enough to be able to cover those screws up, but not so much that you lose your fastening surface. So I've got our pretty good squeeze out here that's filling in this gap. I'll go back with a putty knife and kind of clean it up, maybe fill in some spots where it didn't quite come up fully. It is a good idea to try and clean this up as much as possible before the glue cures fully. The main reason for that is that I've used a colloidal silica and microfibers in this particular glue epoxy mixture, and then I've fared this dynel with 407. Basically, this is softer than this, and so if you are going to sand or try and scrape with a heat gun, you might mess up this surface. You'll sand this before you'll sand the harder epoxy, and that can cause some ridges and weirdness. So in general, I like to clean up epoxy before it's cured, use a little denatured alcohol to wipe down surfaces and that sort of thing. It just saves you a lot of time on the other end once it's cured and you're trying to heat gun, scrape it away, clean it all up. Now we have the boat all planked up. It's a pretty quick process. There's still a few more things you want to do before pulling it off the molds. We're going to get the keel and the skeg fitted and attached to the boat. I'm also going to do the upper and lower guards, and that will stiffen up the shear plank quite a bit. And then if you have a laser level and you want to shoot your water line, you can make sure your setup is totally level, and then get a laser level on there, set your water line. You can even prime the outside of the boat before you flip it over and save yourself a bunch of time on that end.